Thanks, Dan. It's good to be here this afternoon. We appreciate this partnership and appreciate all of you joining us today. So we just want to ask you to take a look at our session aspirations and just share with you a little bit about what we're planning to accomplish this afternoon. So that'll be popping up on your screen. We love technical challenges, but I have sort of two different, there we go. I was gonna say I have sort of two different things popping up on my screen. Wasn't sure if that was my computer or not. So today we just want to make sure that we're helping to ignite that passion for thinking about advocacy differently. If you were in the last session, I loved so much of what Chris and Brian said, but as we think about advocacy a little bit differently from the board perspective, also spark a spirit of curiosity and wonder and think about how we can do some of this work in the boardroom. Making connections between culture, strategy, and practice is one of the things we want to focus on today. And then learning to ask better questions. We sometimes ask the same old questions and wonder why we're getting the same old answers. And then finally, we're hoping to increase a sense of empowerment to embrace advocacy, starting in your boardrooms. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Yodit.
I'm here, I'm in the right room, and it's good to be with you all. Hi, everyone. So if we want to pop back to the former slide, we want to get a sense of who's in the room. And so our Upswell friends are going to put a poll up first to ask your role in your organization. And we're going to do our best to adapt our feedback throughout the session to who's here. You should see that poll. And then the second question is about the degree to which your board is involved in advocacy work, particularly as it relates to racial equity. So if you would take a moment to vote, and we'll take a look at your responses. I'm hoping we've seen the majority of your replies by now, and could we see the results, Upswell friends? So I'll just call out the majority of us here are, like Leslie, Tamela, and I, staff leadership within an organization, followed by about 30% of our group. Oh, I beg your pardon. About 40% of our group serve in change-making and advocacy roles, either as a volunteer or staff person, and then followed by our board members. Thank you for being here. And those of you who are in organizations where grant making is a priority. Fantastic. And then to what degree is your board involved in advocacy work? And where the majority of us are right in the middle to some degree. Thank you for those responses. I'm going to toss it over to Leslie to get us started talking about advocacy.
Thank you, Yodit. I feel like that poll just gave us our charge to move those none at all people into another category. Good to be with everybody this afternoon, and I'm excited to convince you about your role in advocacies. I think all of the panelists believe in the power of boards of directors and that they can make or break organizations. So we're really excited about motivating you to get involved in advocacy. So my job is to sort of level set us a little bit and talk about what it is we mean when we say advocacy and then just talk a little bit about why we feel like people and organization and boards don't do more of it. And I was reminded during the session, hearing about policy, how it can be a little intimidating when you're around people who are steeped in policy. They're comfortable with it, they understand it, they know how it makes its way through the system, and they frankly know the power and the impact. So that was a nice start off. So if we can move to the next slide, or the one after that. Okay, so I want to tell you that this slide is intentionally difficult to read. And that is because we do not want the IRS restrictions, which are real and speak to a 501c3's ability and to lobby. Can you go back one? It speaks to organizations' ability to lobby. What it shouldn't do is cow people and make them reluctant to step into this space at all. And its focus, as you can see on the slide, is really around lobbying as in influencing legislation specifically. So legislation being communicating with policymakers about a particular act, a bill, or a resolution at all levels of government. And that can include, for instance, budget bills. So earmarking of funds for organizations or government agencies who grant funds. And so the rules that you see on the slide, and I promise you, if you Google IRS lobbying nonprofits, this is where you will go. So you can read about it later, about what the restrictions are, but this particular slide is relevant to 501c3s, not C4s and C6s, who do an awful lot more of policy or advocacy. So paying attention again to the slide and the focus on legislative lobbying is really what this is speaking to. And it is not that 501c3s are prohibited from doing any of this, but there is a limit. And this, again, if you Google this, there will be tools and tips for how to calculate how to stay out of trouble with the IRS. And so what this does allow, so I just told you what it doesn't allow. What it does allow are things like candidate forums. And so you could sponsor a forum of various people running for local or state or other office and ask the candidates questions about particularly issues of concern to your nonprofit. You also are allowed to educate both yourself and others about legislation. So that could be your community, it could be your constituents. It also could be legislators. So there are legislators that really look to advocates to understand the complexities of policy issues, the various sides of it, the sources to go to, and the data that's important. I also want to tell you that what is allowed under this section is you can do anything you want on your off time, right? You're a private citizen. So any time towards lobbying, if you take a vacation day or even a sick day, depending on how flexible your organization is, you could be lobbying during that time. So the most important thing I want to point out on this slide, and then we'll move to the next, is again, I said it includes legislative actions. What it doesn't include is executive, judicial, or administrative actions. So you can move to the next slide. So we often talk about, at least in our circles, we talk about big A's and little A's of advocacy. And the big A, what people typically mean is that lobbying, is that legislative work. Also under big A is administrative advocacy, and that is working primarily in the executive section of government to make change. And that path can be easier, more straightforward, less time consuming than pursuing legislation. And so when I think about administrative advocacy, it's hard for me to think of a 501c3 whose mission doesn't have some sort of relationship to rules that are developed or enforced by the executive or judicial branch. So if you're working in hunger, let's say, hunger is related to economic development, inclusive development. It has to do with food deserts. And around the public policy issue of food deserts, there's definitions of deserts, there's criteria, there's funds that are attached to those. There are also things like food stamp rules. If you work with folks around incarceration or any sort of criminal justice, there are policies at all levels of government regarding those policies, including privatizing those functions. One of my first introductions to the power of administrative advocacy professionally was meeting the folks at the state level who were responsible for setting priorities for Section 8 housing. And I came to quickly understand that these people in the state office chose every year 3 groups who would jump to the top of the priority list for Section 8. And so I lobbied for domestic violence victims to be one of those 3 groups, and they were, and it happened really easily. I would say if you're struggling to find your mission within equity, I would ask yourself about systemic inequities that have a disproportionate impact on a variety of conditions or the status of the people that you care about. Little a advocacy is sort of everything else. It's the empowerment of yourself. It's the ability to influence and create change. I would want to flag for you that part of the little a, again, is using data, collecting it, analyzing it, using it to show trends, to tell the story of your own organization, and again, to educate policy makers and other constituents. I also want to encourage you to find advocates that work within government systems. And so back in the old days, which is a long time ago, people used to say to me, if people like you as an advocate, you're not doing your job. And I would say, in order to do your job well, you create change. And so if that means not alienating people within the system, that's what you should do. And I absolutely believe that there are a portion of advocates that go to work within the system in order to create change. Next slide. So this is just sort of a heads up to, once you understand what's allowable, what's not allowable, to really think about using that allowable time strategically. So maximize, again, what you can do with the executive, judicial, or administrative actions without running afoul from IRS rules, and then create your entire plan around that for, again, kind of big A and little a. So I'm going to sort of end up and toss it over to Yodit with, you can go to the next slide, with just a couple of observations that we have about what holds people back. So why don't more people undertake big A or little a? Why do they not feel empowered? Why don't they build this into their plans? And there are probably more, but these are our 4. One is that people get intimidated by policy language or policy action or the process. And so the idea of, you remember that song when you were little about how does a bill become a bill? If you're intimidated by, I don't understand how our state legislature works. I just know it's highly political and it's divided, and I wouldn't know the first thing about where to plug in. So that holds people back. I would encourage you to join listservs or coalitions that are out there to translate that stuff for you, and embrace it and dedicate yourself to understanding it. You could even take like a professional development course around understanding legislation. The second, I'm afraid, is that some people use the IRS rules to avoid responsibility. So once they hear there's some prohibition on lobbying, they sort of walk away from that responsibility without a clear understanding about what those guardrails are. And again, I would encourage you to take the time to understand those. They also, organizations don't necessarily take the time to figure out the proper role as staff or board, and Tamela is going to talk about what boards can do. Boards and staff, it's important to have that separation and partnership of who does what, and it takes some time, right, to figure out who should be doing what, and that includes in the area of advocacy. Also, there is a tendency, I think, to think narrowly about advocacy, and there are countless things that you can do to get involved. So the last bullet point about it, people saying it's not our job, or it's too controversial, or our board is not going to go along with this, they're going to get concerned, is, I would say, if not now, when? This is absolutely the time, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Yodit, who is going to inspire and empower and activate you. Right, Yodit?
I'm right on top of that, Leslie.
Thank you.
I hope so, and I appreciate ending on this question of if not now, when, and just thinking of our earlier panelists and the call for urgency. So I want to maybe focus a little bit more on little a as a strategy for organizational leaders and boards to take up as we move to big A activities where applicable. But what we know is that to advocate is to take a public stance. And that public stance is not just on our social media channels or in our friend groups or at the dinner table. It really is our courage to speak up and to act outwardly. It requires of us that we disrupt the status quo, that we embrace courage, and that we name the presence of power, which is also here when you talk about the limiting language and the lack of knowledge and awareness about what the rules are. And I worry a little bit, even with big A advocacy, because I have seen in my work with organizations and communities for nearly 25 years, those advocating not having deep relationship or lived experience or acting on behalf of communities for whom they have not listened deeply. And an example of that, I would say, is in our ongoing efforts to reform police at a big A level. We have failed miserably, and we continue to see Black and brown bodies impacted by a system of policing that is rooted in some of our oldest policies related to the humanity and freedom of Black people. So as an organizational leader, and I serve as the president and CEO of nonprofit enterprise at work here in the occupied lands of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, and Three Rivers peoples, also known as Ypsilanti, Michigan. And I lead an organization where we are becoming more comfortable with naming and educating ourselves, including our board. So there is an element of coaching up our clients, our funders, and the ecosystem actors, and saying what is true and real for us, which is that the majority of our sector exists because of structural inequity. And that we have been to the point of why is this a board's job? Because so many of our organizations and many of those I work alongside are working at the downstream impact of racism, poverty, and trauma. And moreover, as a sector, we've sort of been at the will of the benevolent donor who seeks to do good for all intents and purposes, and oh, by the way, loves that tax break. And so advocacy could look like you as our participants and leaders and board members naming that and asking the question, what are the contexts and conditions that exist that impede our ability to meet our mission? And I serve on a couple boards myself, and that is our job, to ensure that the organizations we serve are able to meet their missions and close their doors, not simply to service racism, poverty, and trauma, but to uproot it and to dismantle it. And I would assert that our understanding of our role in advocacy is tied to that. So I want to offer, before we move to the next slide, just a couple of shifts that we made internally. I won't necessarily show this on this slide, but I thought it was a great foundation for those who are thinking about what might I do right away. So we first named the context we're operating in. And some of that is that many of our organizations are challenged by white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist, cis hetero, ableist, patriarchal cultures. And we are responding to needs without addressing root causes. We also recognize that there are systems of people and organizations that really care about changing the conditions in their community, and that there is also a system of competition and scarcity that pervades our sector and limits our ability to work towards collective action and change. And advocacy is rooted in that. And we also recognize as a context for our work that historically impacted and marginalized folks are often not at the center of our change efforts. And so we believe that as a sector, as an organization, as an intermediary, that ongoing relationships with values-aligned leaders and organizations can really lead to systemic change, that it takes time, as some of our other speakers said, it's the marathon, not the sprint, and that it's often emergent and nonlinear, that culture will eat strategy for breakfast. And so it's important that our cultures are flourishing, our organizational cultures that is, and that our norms are rooted in our shared liberation. We also recognize that systemic change can only be realized at an ecosystem level. And so I want to just move to the sort of why slide next, if we could. And yeah, we can shift to the next slide and kind of just talk about some why nows. These persistent and oppressive conditions in our communities demand our now. I use the metaphor that the water is sick and we keep treating the fish. We are being called through our activism and our advocacy to uproot those downstream impacts I mentioned. And while I understand as a race equity practitioner and someone who strives for liberation for all people and as a human rights activist, that particularly the last year and a half has revealed primarily for white folks in this nation, perhaps an unknown complicity in upholding systems of oppression, and that the acuity or the acuteness of that realization led many of our brothers and sisters to go from awareness to action without understanding the deep, the necessary analysis to uproot and upend. And so I want to encourage folks to slow down. Our framework that we use is about deepening our awareness, understanding that through a lens of analysis, then moving to action and in solidarity. And so, as I said at the onset, our advocacy, little and big A advocacy, has to be rooted in and in solidarity with impacted communities. And so with that, I want to volley over to Tamela. Oh, before we go to Tamela, I want to show you a couple of examples from our community. One, next slide, please, is a project in Washtenaw County here, and it really feeds well with what Leslie was saying about our candidate forums. So we had a prosecutor in town who'd been in place for over 30 years. In the last 2 years, he had incarcerated dozens of youth. And that sort of came on the heels of a prosecutorial culture, a culture of incarceration. And so a group of folks came together. They called themselves Liberate, Don't Incarcerate. And they created a vision. And I think our advocacy work must be rooted in abundance, in a vision of transformation that we can see be real for us now. And what we wanted was to create a county that is grounded in love and communal healing, and that embodies collective accountability for all, but that also moves away from systems of dominance and mass incarceration. And so as we were gearing up for our prosecutor election, this group not only held forums, in which case they created scorecards and other platforms for people to engage, but we used storytelling and narrative to allow a space for our community in the spirit of designing with and not for, to put forth how can we create a place where we are diminishing punitive and a carceral state and embracing accountability as an alternative. And the community was successful in electing a prosecutor who within 30 days of being elected decriminalized sex work, who yesterday or this past week put forth a number of policies to help folks who had prior records. And so we're already beginning to see the fruits of that imaginative advocacy, little a advocacy work. And then I wanted to share in the next slide an example of an organization doing advocacy work that I think is inspiring and unique. So again, I mentioned I'm in Ypsilanti, which is a suburb of Ann Arbor, home of the University of Michigan, as well as the University of Michigan's Museum of Art. Can we go to the next slide? And the Museum of Art, I think we might have missed one. I'll tell you while we're sitting on this slide, but if we can go back one, that'd be great. The University of Michigan, there we go, Museum of Art, Modern Art, itself created, the staff and board created an anti-racism action plan. And if you're interested, you can see that plan, which is where the roots of their advocacy began. And it entails a deep examination of the role historically of museums in upholding narrow and single narratives, not just of art, but of who is worthy of the white gaze. And also, they embraced using their space in the walls of the museum to challenge some of the legacies of slavery and colonialism that are often upheld in museums. And so what you're looking at is an example of an upcoming exhibition. First, it'll be virtual, and then by fall, we're hoping it's healthy enough for folks to come into space, but where we have a chance to go behind the story of many of the images we see on the walls in the museum. And this is an institutional effort, and I hoped you might be inspired. Leslie, maybe I got it done, that folks might be inspired to think about what are the practices beyond your statements that went out, but how can we model, if advocacy is public, how can we model our advocacy in our organizational actions while we're building our capacity for the larger big A response. And so if you haven't had, you may wish to visit their site where you can see both their commitment, and I call it kind of learning out loud, I think is a form of advocacy as well. So much of how dominant culture works is that we are crippled by a need to do our work with perfection. And we know that true justice and liberation work has a messy path, as does advocacy, and as does racial justice and liberation. So now I will turn it over to my colleague, Tamela.
Thanks, Yodit. Appreciate those examples. So where do we start? When we think about our boards, where do we actually start this work? We've had a couple of great examples of organizations that have done some good work. Some of you might be thinking, that's great, but my board doesn't get it. So where do we begin? So when we think about where to begin, it really starts in the boardroom. How do we actually make sure that our board is educated? How do we make sure that our board understands that they play a role in all of this? So if we can, there we go, thank you. I know we have a little bit of a lag with computers. I've decided that all computers are just tired because, you know, we've kind of been overworking them this past year. So when we think about the beginnings of this process, I love that Yodit talked about naming it. We really have to name it. We have to get honest in our own organization and say, what is it we're trying to accomplish? If we are working with challenges of homelessness or hunger or some of these big social issues, our desire should not be to celebrate, oh, we served more people this month. Our desire should be to go out of business. Let's think about how do we solve problems. And if that's the framework that we take, if that's where we begin to think about our work, then that means we have to take time in the boardroom to educate our board, not only on the challenges, these social issues that we're trying to solve, but also on their role in solving those. So make sure that we're educating them on the issues, but also make sure we're educating them on things like cultural intelligence. How do they know how to show up in a community? Because as was mentioned with our last breakout session with Chris and Brian, they talked about serving with. We need to be in community with, and that means we need to prepare our board members to actually show up in community well. So that might require some cultural intelligence. We know from research, the vast majority of boards in this country are white males over 55. We might need a little bit of work on how to show up in communities where we don't typically show up. So that's that education. While you're doing that education, you can create buy-in in your boardroom. Make sure that your board understands. It is a challenge sometimes for executive directors and board members to find that perfect balance of partnership. We know that. We see it all over the country. And as we begin to think about that, it's really important that you take time to get that partnership. And I'm not talking years, but do the work, do the groundwork to build that partnership in your boardroom, because your board can be your greatest asset. It can also be your greatest challenge. We want it to be your greatest asset. So take time to build, educate, create that buy-in in the boardroom. Make sure that when you're creating your strategy documents, when you're building your strategic framework, that you are connecting your strategy work to the desired change in the community. What is it that we believe? What is it that we're trying to actually accomplish? So that you're creating the right metrics to measure both the big A and the small a advocacy. So often the work that we do in our local community, I think we forget every single day it's advocacy. Every single day we're doing small a advocacy. When we're building partnerships in the community, when we're creating awareness for the folks that we're working with, when we're building relationship, it's all advocacy work. So be intentional about naming it and talking about that and creating those metrics. We know that as Leslie just popped into the chat box, that as we think about diversifying our boards, this is one way we are going to create stronger opportunities to do some of this change work in our communities. The other thing you want to make sure is that you have some tools in place. If you're going to get serious about advocating, then you really need to make sure that your CRM system allows you to do that relationship tracking. Make sure that you have your communications in order so that you do understand how to message this. And as Yodit pointed out, this isn't about nonprofit organizations walking in and solving a problem for or doing work to. This is about stepping into community and creating partnerships and being with and being part of community. It's incredibly important that we know that that's the step we're taking. And I just want to mention, as we're starting to do this work with boards, one of the things that might happen is we're going to create some discomfort. Yodit mentioned the importance of courage. This work takes courage. And when we start having some of these conversations, particularly around issues of racial equity and really grounding our work there, because it does start there in many cases, as we begin to have these conversations, and if we are in predominantly white boardrooms, there might be some discomfort. That's okay. Set some ground rules. Learn how to, I love to Brene Brown's term, learn how to rumble. Like, how do we have good conflict and conversation so that we're actually moving things forward? So learn how to rumble and step into the discomfort, because if you're going to get serious about advocacy work, it might get uncomfortable, and that's okay. Just figure out how can we step into this in a way that honors all of the relationships that we have. So once you kind of build that base, you get that groundwork done, then we need to think about how do we really solve big problems by shifting power. So advocacy is about shifting power, speaking up, elevating the voices of people who don't have the power. So we can go to the next slide. We want to think about solving big problems by shifting power. Whose voice gets heard in the room? Whose voice do we listen to? I think our slide deck might be frozen. That's all right. We'll keep going. So when we think about how do we elevate voices, how do we communicate across channels? When do we as an organization, particularly if we are predominantly white-led organization, when do we step back and be quiet and help the voices in the community be heard? And that's a tough thing to do sometimes. So as we think about solving these big problems by shifting power, one of the things we want to do is think movement building. I know we've all heard this for the last couple of years in the sector, but movement building really is about leveraging our relationships to build social capital. Social capital is that trust. Social capital is that reciprocity in relationship. Reciprocity means we're in a relationship with. Reciprocity means we're working with. We're being in community with. We're not doing two. It's a different relationship. So as we think about mobilizing a movement, it does boil down to that social capital. How do we leverage the relationships that we have, grow our network, build that network, show up in community so that we have reciprocal relationships and we're building social capital? That's what's going to get people behind you. That's what's going to get your board excited. That's what's going to get your constituents excited. That's what's going to help you sort of start that ball rolling. And once you get that momentum moving, that's going to take off. So where do we go? What do we do? How do we actually start this process? So I want to just encourage you to find a small starting point. It doesn't have to be anything big. It doesn't have to be, we're going to go out tomorrow, we're going to create this big event. We're going to make a splash. We're going to take a big stand on a huge national issue. It doesn't have to be that. It can be that if you've done your prep work. But it could be something as small as, how do we join a coalition in our community at a local level so that we're creating connections? Where do we go in our own community to find out what the lay of the land is? And of course, connecting with IS, staying up to knowing what's going on at a national level, but also bringing it down to that local level. I think too often when we think advocacy, we only look at the big A that Leslie talked about. And we forget the power of the local movements. We forget the power of what happens at a local level. And it's important to make sure that we are building those relationships at a local level. Okay. So the other thing that we want to think about when we're taking action is, how do we build our partnerships in our community? How do we know who is in the playing field? It's important for us not to act alone. I think advocacy is best done with others. Advocacy is most powerful when we join voices together. It's a culture shift sometimes because we've gotten pretty good in the nonprofit sector about kind of protecting our own turf and doing our own thing. And sometimes it's a culture shift for us to think about joining a coalition, working together on a joint letter, building a partnership, and don't worry about who gets credit. Focus on what you're trying to accomplish instead of how is our institution being built in this process. And then the other thing is to really be thoughtful about how we continue to grow these processes. This is, for many organizations, a culture shift. Oftentimes, that is messy. It's going to cause some people to walk away. We may find some board members in our boardroom that are going to dig their heels in and say, why on earth are we doing this? That's okay. Bless and release. I was working with a client this morning, and one of the people in the room, as they've been crafting a vision statement over the last couple days and really thinking differently about their work. And one of the people in the room said, "This vision is too big and we'll never get there. So I don't even know why we're going to try." I said, "Well, if the vision's too big, you probably got a good vision statement, right? If we think we can never get there, that's probably the right vision statement." And so as we talked and we kind of went through things, this individual kept kind of digging his heels in, like, "I just don't think it's going to work." And I made the comment at one point in the conversation that the reality is, as we start shifting our culture, as we start thinking about our work differently, as we start finding our courage and taking more risk, the reality is not everybody's going to be comfortable, and that's okay. That might mean it's time for them to move on to a different organization. That might mean it's time for them to try something different. So don't be afraid of that. Do it in a way that honors everybody involved, but also recognize that we can nurture, we can adjust culture, we can be thoughtful about all the relationships involved. But when culture shifts, people are always afraid of what they are going to lose in the process. I love what Sam Cobb says. People are not afraid of change, they're afraid of loss. So as you're navigating the space and you're thinking about that culture shift in your own organization, be thoughtful about what's the loss that some may encounter, because it'll happen in your boardroom and it's okay. Give yourself permission to have that loss. And the other thing is, you think about growing and developing your muscle for advocacy, both big A and small a advocacy. Think about the structures that you're creating in your relationship. What do you talk about at a board meeting? How are your board meetings structured in a way that nurtures conversations around advocacy? How are your board meetings structured so that you're always connecting the advocacy work that you're doing to your strategic framework? How are your board meetings structured so that when you think about advocacy, it's always tied to your mission? Where do those conversations happen? Too often, they happen with staff and board isn't engaged. We need to make sure those conversations are brought into the boardroom, ideally starting in the boardroom, so that we are engaging a really powerful tool. Our board is a really powerful tool. Let's make sure we're leveraging that well. And I just want to point out to you, as you think about taking action and you begin to think about how you shift your boards for some of this, just one final thing before we kind of dig into some questions, because we would love to hear from all of you, is I just want you to understand there's really a donor development benefit to all of this as well. So when we think about advocacy, sometimes it can feel like, I don't know, it's hard work to get my board in the right place. It's hard work to convince my board we need to do this. Point out to your board that there's a benefit to you financially as an organization. So when you think about how we do this work well, if you want to pop up the next slide, advocates are 7 times more likely to donate to your organization than someone who is not engaged as an advocate. So if you're building that social capital, you're leveraging the relationships in the boardroom, you're leveraging the relationships across your organization, you're engaging people in advocacy work, they're going to be 7 times more likely to give you a financial donation. That pays off.
Hey,
There's
Tamela,
also,
can I say one thing
yeah,
about that, if you don't mind?
yeah.
Because another decision that I made this year in support of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities is not to take money from certain folks, which is sort of a radical idea. But if you no longer align to our values of justice and liberation, not just for BIPOC folks, but really for all of us, then we can't be in right relationship with you. So I think it goes both ways. I have also benefited, particularly as a Black woman leader at this moment in time, from what I have sort of tongue-in-cheek called the guilt money. Over the last year, we had an unprecedented flow of cash, which I think in some ways does speak to what you said, and also that our relationship with money. And so
Mhm.
we as a sector have this interesting relationship with donors who can behave badly, who can
Mhm.
give sometimes, who can have great expectations that are unreasonable to meet. And so I think there's a form of sort of self-advocacy that can happen that can make us less performative and also be values aligned. So just wanted to mention that there's like the rub of
Right.
both sides of that. Mhm.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Yodit. And I think it's really important. We've seen this play out over the last couple of years. The one that just popped into my head, Sackler. We've all seen this play out, right? Many, many institutions were removing the Sackler name from their buildings. So when we think about values, and this is really a conversation you can have in the boardroom when you're beginning to lay the groundwork for good advocacy work. Do you have a gift acceptance policy? Is it tied to what you believe about advocacy? Is it tied to your strategy? Is it tied to your mission? Really think through that with your board. Why is that important? Who do we cultivate relationship with? Where do we take funding from? It's incredibly important for us to be honest about that as organizations. And that's going to look different for every single one of you. We're not here to make that choice or decision for you, but sit down with your board, sit down with your staff, have those conversations so that you are making sure that your board is engaged in the process and they understand it. And that will minimize challenges for your organization later on. Okay. So as you think about the benefits, that's just one tiny little thing to sort of help people understand there's a connection to everything that we do. It's connected to fund development work. It's connected to our PR. It's connected to who engages with us as volunteers. It's connected to who decides to engage and sit on our board. And so I think that it is important for us to be honest about those conversations in our own organization. And with that, we want to leave some time for questions. We'd love to hear from you. What's standing in the way? What are the challenges you're bumping into with your boards? You've got, I don't know, 100 years of experience between the three of us in this
Just speak
sector.
for yourself. Just speak for yourself. I just turned 25.
Oh no, all of us
Just-
together. Cumulative. We've got a
There's
little
a
bit.
question in the there's a question that I want to put forth, and I think it's really relevant. I'll put it out there for the three of us. So this person says the country is split nearly in half along political lines. How do we swell the movement to make it more compelling for those who are not currently with us? And what I would offer is focus our attention on the movable base. I think we've wasted a lot of energy trying to persuade people who won't be moved, and that with the limited energy, resource, time that we have, that we should focus on the movable base. And I think we saw evidence of that with what Stacey Abrams was able to do in Georgia. And I think we've seen evidence of that, frankly, with I wonder how history will be written around the Derek Chauvin trial, but surely it was those who were in the streets holding up a belief that Black Lives Matter that catalyzed a 21st century civil rights movement that led to that decision. And so let's focus on our energy and our time and our efforts, whether that be at the board or in the relationships we're developing or the donors we seek. Let's focus on the movable base. I wonder what y'all think. Leslie, we haven't heard from you in a little bit.
I was going to be a little bit contrarian. And that is, I think there's value in understanding the basis for where people are. And I would also just pay attention. If you have a policymaker, you have someone who's in a position of authority, I think you do want to understand their position. And I agree, you only have so much time to persuade them otherwise. I also think when we talk about educating about the process of advocacy, that's one thing. There's also educating just on policies, like Yodi, when you were talking about prosecutorial policies, I don't know if people have, everybody's been watching millions of hours of Netflix, but the documentary on Kalief Browder, and there are a number of interviews with prosecutors and lawyers in that documentary that say, you know, if we didn't have plea bargaining, our system would come crashing down. Well, are we willing to accept that we have to plea bargain some astronomical percentage of sentences as a way for our system to work? And so I think there are, you know, small questions, big questions, smaller battles, larger battles, depends who's in. But and I also just think, again, there's great value in going into the system to find people that you might persuade or educate.
Yeah, and I think it's important to find those bright spots, right? Find those little movements. Where are we making progress? And think about, how do we replicate those instead of focusing our energy on where things aren't working. Find the bright spots, replicate the bright spots, and then that's what's going to create that momentum, right? That's what movement building is all about. And
Yeah.
so, yeah. And I know Yodi, you wanted to address this second question. I'll let you dive in before I do.
So the question was asked, you mentioned discomfort with advocacy and lobbying. We've heard board members already don't want to help raise money. Now we need to ask them to advocate too. How do we help them feel more comfortable? So two things that come to my mind. One is that a function of dominant culture is a right to comfort. White folks in particular feel as though they have a right to comfort. In my experience is I've seen far too many Indigenous, Brown, and Black bodies fall behind that comfort and that silence. At a maybe more of a macro level, as someone who recently chaired the United Way of Washtenaw County Board and was instrumental as a catalyst to have now United Ways all over the country taking racial equity challenges all over the world, really, because of our courage to publicize learning as a tool of justice. I would say don't focus on making folks more comfortable, but I do believe, as Audre Lorde said, that the personal is political. And so somebody put in the comment box, how do people connect? And I think often we come into advocacy and lobbying from a deficit position, right? We have to help, or we have to fight for. And my experience has been, even with people who hold different beliefs than me, is if we seek the places where we do have shared understanding, where we do have a shared desire for change. So if I believe Black and Brown children have been failed in America's education system, but if I talk to somebody who maybe isn't as conversant on that inequity, and I say to them, don't we believe children deserve to thrive and flourish and be set up for the greatest opportunities in their lifetime? The answer is a resounding yes. So you meet them where they are, but I wouldn't start with trying to make them comfortable. And finally, our job as board trustees is to advance the work of our missions. That's what we're elected to do. And there's no way possible, if we're continuing to service the issues that our missions are up against, that we can actually solve them.
Yeah, and that's part of that education piece, right? Where do we start with our boards? Helping them understand how advocacy work actually connects to fulfilling our mission. So I think it's really important that we create that context. We have to help our board understand that context first. And this isn't about, let's give them one more task that they're going to fight us on, because it's not about a task. This is about having those deep conversations in your organization and being able to say, what do we believe? What do we actually stand on? What do we actually stand for? Whose voices do we need to make sure we're getting out of the way so that they can be elevated? And in having those conversations in the boardroom, living in that discomfort and being okay with that. But you're going to have to set some context for that. You're going to have to create some guardrails, so to speak, for your board to begin to have those conversations in a way that we're honoring all relationships, because the last thing we want to do is to, sever a lot of those relationships. So we're going to have to be thoughtful about those guardrails. So, examples of how board members may provide a unique value add to an organization's advocacy work that make it worth pushing them through their discomfort. Well, we talked a little bit about discomfort and reluctance already. I think there's a couple of things, and Leslie, you may want to jump in on this as well. When we think about board members, two things that pop into my head. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, they can be your greatest asset or your greatest barrier. As we begin to think about how resources are being used, budget conversations, if they don't understand where advocacy fits in, then that's going to make those budget conversations where we want to invest dollars into advocacy work a little bit more difficult. If board members don't understand why we are engaged in advocacy work, when they're out in the community telling the story of your organization, they're going to miss it. And so this is where they can be value add for you and your organization. Do you want to jump in with anything else, Leslie?
I think we're just about out of time, but I guess I would go back to this idea of board composition. You may actually have members in the room already who are passionate, who want to speak to it, but they don't think it's their role. They don't have the go ahead from the rest of the board. And so developing that, and then never being afraid to revisit the composition of your board. If you don't have the courage, if you don't have anyone in the room who's willing to ask those hard questions, to be uncomfortable, to make other people uncomfortable, the other thing you need to think about is just sort of balance. You don't want to bring a new member in and say, okay, now it's your job to make everybody uncomfortable. Good luck with that. So really paying attention to the idea that, as Tamela said, you want it to be part of the responsibility, and you want to create this culture.